So the story of creating the Constitution begins in the early spring of 1787, after a few years of the Confederation Congress and the Articles of Confederation. Enough people in that Congress realized we needed some kind of a change. They wanted some sort of revision, so they voted to allow a new meeting. A convention would meet in Philadelphia to revise, to make changes to those Articles of Confederation. So each state sent members. But Virginia's members had a different kind of idea that they'd been working on for a while. And George Washington was one of those who was not in the Congress, but had been frustrated ever since the Revolutionary War, times like Valley Forge, when he wasn't getting things done. The Congress wasn't getting things done. And James Madison is a name we'll hear a lot. He comes with a real plan that he's been working on for a while. So when they get there, one of the first things that happens is he and other Virginians share their idea. Now they think it should be about designing a new government for the United States, totally replacing the Articles. So this purpose of the meeting totally changes. Most other members are convinced to agree. Of course, having George Washington there helps a whole lot for that. If George Washington wants it, then more people are going to want it as well. So when they get to that meeting, remember the process started in early spring, but they're going to be there for 4 months of the summer, through June, July, August, and September. And you know how they would always dress with those kind of tight collars, so you can imagine this being pretty hot. And then they had to make the meeting secret, because remember, they've changed the purpose of this meeting, and they don't want all that news getting out until they're done. So the windows are closed, and makes it even hotter than it would have been otherwise. They're working almost every day of those 4 months. Some men come and go a little bit, but mostly they're working and really taking this very seriously. There's a lot of debates between folks, which we'll get into a little bit later. A lot of arguments. Some men threat to quit. A few of them actually do. A couple from New York, for example, actually leave pretty early on and don't come back. So you can just imagine the volume being so loud in this sort of meeting chamber. You can imagine the tension between men as they're trying to figure this out. And you can imagine the smell of these guys meeting in this locked up room as they're trying to keep the meeting secret, right in the hot days, muggy days of summer. So what happened at that meeting? Well, we know a lot of it from James Madison's notes. He took very careful notes during the convention, so we got a lot from him about what kinds of things went on. It may be somewhat biased from his point of view, but that's pretty much the best we have to go by. We know they covered many, many topics, some things that didn't even get into the Constitution, but many of the things they discussed did end up in there in some way. So here are some of the things they talk about. A president. There was no president in the Articles of Confederation, but they realized they need some kind of leader. At one point it was maybe going to be a group of leaders, like 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, like a council of some kind. Slavery is a huge topic of debate in multiple ways, which we'll get into in more detail at a later time, but slavery comes up as a big piece of conversation for them. Also, just how much can the people really be trusted? At the beginning it says we the people, but these are still rich, elite guys, very well educated guys who are worried about mobs like happened, like the Boston Tea Party and times like that. You have larger states with large populations. How can they deal with small states? Is each state really going to have its own power, or should this really be based more on the populations of states? And the states had a lot of power in these Articles of Confederation. Should they get to keep as much power? How are they going to share it with the national government? That's frankly still a big topic of concern. And then you have cultural differences between Southerners, Northerners. There are areas where English isn't the main language. How are these folks going to get pulled together? So that just really races through those 4 months. Only 39 of the original 55, started with 55 men, only 39 of them actually signed this document, and some states only had 1 representative. So after the convention finally ends, they realize they need to send this out to the states. They'd had this pretty private, and remember the meeting had totally changed from its original purpose. So the document goes out to the states, and it has to be ratified That means approved. It has to be approved by each of those states to join. So there's a process to this, and the first step of that process is that each state government, each state legislature had to have a vote about when they were going to hold a ratification convention, capital R, capital C, when the state was going to have a vote on, will Delaware, will Massachusetts approve this thing? And after 9 states ratified, 9 out of the 13, that's all it would take to replace the Articles of Confederation. That was the plan. So first the states vote, second, then once it's decided what the date will be, then voters would get to elect representatives to that state government. So from each town would get to send someone to this convention. And so if you're one of those voters, you would be choosing someone to send based on what you know of that man's opinion about the article, about the Constitution. An opponent was labeled an anti-federalist, against having a more powerful federal or national central kind of government. And this is a huge discussion topic through all the rest of 1787 and most of 1788. This debate about the power of government and what we should have really led to political parties, kind of like the Democrat-Republican parties we have today. That debate's still going on. So the third step was actually the conventions. Whoever had been elected, those members would debate. Sometimes they didn't vote the way that they'd said they were going to vote at first, which causes more debate later on. So this would last for about a week or two. Some of them, like New York's, lasted for 5 weeks, but usually it was just about a week, maybe 2 weeks. Massachusetts had its convention in the spring of 1788. That was the 6th state, number 6, to agree to ratify. But the first vote didn't quite go right. They kept voting and voting until it ended up going through. This was a very suspenseful year, 1788, a very suspenseful, very dramatic year. It was not certain that this Constitution was going to become the new government. It really took a long process, 3 steps of that process. So finally, once we get there, in the summer of 1788, this is a year after, or more than a year, really, after the process started. In June, New Hampshire is state number 9 to ratify it. So that means, according to the rules of this new Constitution, boom, you've got your 9th state. The other 4 states have to go along. But New York and Virginia, 2 of the largest states, hadn't signed on yet. It took a bit longer for those to do. If they hadn't, we might have had a sort of divided country, if you can imagine New York and Virginia being their own countries. It's hard to imagine, but by December of 1788, we had our first election, first presidential election and first Congress election, and spoiler alert, George Washington wins, duh. Of course, you already knew that. So bye-bye, the Confederation Congress is all gone. It's going to be replaced by this new United States Congress. A lot of the guys who were at the convention actually end up getting voted into Congress, so they kind of set up their next job opportunity. So that wraps up the story of creating the Constitution.